While Labour government ministers continue to show their pretty much endless elasticity when it comes to both principles and pragmatism, one British politician has managed to hold the line on both. Not that the British media has made it easy for him. This was your party co-founder and former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn on Sky News last night.
Obviously talking about Nicolas Maduro, who has been in court in New York today. He has described himself as a decent man. Do you think he's a decent man?
He's the president of Venezuela, and the issue is the illegality of what the United States have done. It isn't whether he's a nice man or a bad man or a good man or whatever. The question is, international law does not allow one country, even the USA, to go in and kidnap the president of another country. If they do that, how are they going to complain if anybody else does the same anywhere else?
Let me take on both of those things if I can. It does matter, surely, if he's a decent... I mean, is he a friend of yours? Would you describe him as a friend?
I've met him. I was interviewed by him on a television programme many years ago while I was at the UN Human Rights Council, and he was deputy to Chavez, as you know, and the country has obviously had enormous problems, not least because of the huge level of sanctions by the USA on it, and that has created a lot of problems. Now,
would you describe him as a friend, though, or an ally?
I don't know him well enough to be able to say that.
OK. The reason I say this, you say it doesn't matter whether he's a decent guy or not. I mean, this is from Amnesty International. You're an internationalist. Amnesty is an important organisation, saying that last year after the presidential election, 24 people died as a result of the government's repression. 2 of the victims were children, and 1 was a police officer. There's been arbitrary detentions on unfair trials. Now, let's park aside what the United States done for a second. Surely it's a good thing that he's not president of Venezuela anymore,
but
given
that should be...
he is not a nice guy.
Kieran, I just have to pause there for a moment because, you know, can you imagine in any world a Sky journalist pulling out, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu's stats on child killings and asking a guest to admit he's not a nice guy before being allowed to proceed to defend him in some way or to talk about the Israeli state's role in Gaza? Unbelievable, isn't it?
Right. So whenever any of the kind of stock defenders or apologists of child murder in Gaza, systematic mass child murder in Gaza, or genocide, or people who want to come out and find nuances and philosophize around the edges of starvation in Gaza, they're never asked, what do you think about Benjamin Netanyahu? They're never asked, what do you think about Ben Gvir? They're never asked what they think about any of that stuff. So, yeah, absolutely. And it's not just by the way that Jeremy Corbyn was asked at the tail end of a more substantive piece. It's that the guy led with it and actually even said the words, let's leave aside for a moment what the US has done. It's extraordinary. Let's leave aside for a moment the entire basis of this conversation in any sensible or sane world. That guy was such a brainless lapdog, and unfortunately so many media pundits of his ilk are. But yeah, it's absolutely maddening for the comparative reasons that you draw rightly, Stephen, with Israel, but also just the way in which such people think that they are there simply to confuse very, very obvious wrongdoing in terms of international law.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I also want to say, you know, the way he brings out amnesty and uses an amnesty report to support his argument. I feel, you know, I can't say about this journalist in particular, but I feel like there are so many journalists of that ilk who would just discredit amnesty when it comes to their sort of setting the agenda over some particular piece of international news, some particular figure that they, for example, or the mainstream in this country supports. So, yeah, I mean, like for me personally, you know, I generally, you know, trust Amnesty and trust various other international organizations, and, you know, very happy to listen to that the report as given there in respect to Venezuela. But I don't think with these kind of corporate media types it plays the other way at all. The sources are cherry picked for the argument they want to make, and they're thrown away for they're dismissed or discredited when they make an argument that they don't.
Absolutely, and they don't push back as well. I mean, even if they don't recognise them as authoritative sources themselves, even when they're discredited by pro-Israel guests, say, I'll use that example repetitively because it's the most, you know, present and evergreen example at the moment. But ultimately, they never push back against any poo-pooing or rubbishing of Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, you name it, the United Nations. Every single one of those organisations is dismissed by apologists of mass systemic child killing in Gaza. And individuals like that presenter, whose name I don't know and don't wish to know, will never push back against it. They'll never, as you say, they'll never question.
Yeah. All right, let's go on to the next bit of that interview with Corbyn.
I read the Amnesty report, and obviously I was very disturbed by what was in it. And I've also read a great deal and met a lot of people who've described the terrible economic situation that Venezuela faces. And so there's a twin set of problems there that have to be addressed. Now, if the US was serious about dealing with human rights abuses, which they are not. They're not anywhere in the world.
Yeah, but are you? That's my point.
Of course I am.
Well, you have to. Well, why don't you say categorically he was a pretty evil
You seem to
dictator?
be trying to move this whole conversation away from the reality of what Trump has done. Invaded another country.
But if you answer the
told
question, if you condemn him, I'll move on.
It's so triggering to watch that, because it really reminds me of the months after October 7th, where in order for anybody to be allowed to participate in a discussion of October 7th itself, what followed, the Israeli state's savage assault on Gaza, you first had to condemn something. You weren't allowed to have a ticket to speaking in the media, to putting a view forward, unless you'd already shown that you occupied a certain position within what was acceptable to them, and that involved condemnation. And you're seeing it exactly the same here. Condemn Maduro, otherwise shut up. And also, and the refusal to condemn, as it was after October 7th, functions in exactly the same way here. The refusal to condemn sets you up as immediately discredited, because you must have some kind of allegiance to whatever it is that you're being asked to condemn, even when what you want to talk about is the larger crime that is occurring. Or a specific crime by a much more powerful force that's occurring. Doesn't mean you're dismissing any other crimes. It just means that there is something that you want to focus on, which the media, politicians, the establishment in general, does not want anybody to focus on. And that's exactly what happened here, and it's exactly what happened in those months in 2023.
Just very briefly to add to that, Stephen, obviously what that individual is doing there is, in his own small, brainless way, trying to manufacture consent for this and trying to normalise something that is highly abnormal and should not be normalised. So by trying to manufacture, and these guys, they never learn. Leave aside for a moment all of the hypocrisy that we just talked about with Netanyahu and all the war criminals that are greeted and toasted in European capitals and so on. Leaving aside all of that for a moment, the manufacturing of, Iraq, the same thing was done. Saddam, do you like Saddam? Do you really like Saddam? Are you saying that you think Saddam is a great guy? Why won't you just condemn Saddam? And tying those two things together, a sort of personality test of Saddam Hussein. It's important to say Maduro certainly no Saddam Hussein, but tying together those two things as though you have to think that Saddam Hussein was a great guy in order to foresee the disaster of the collapse of the country if the war in Iraq was prosecuted. We live in a kind of state of eternal return with these people because they have such short memories, or they're trained to have such short memories, or because material interests ensure that they have short memories.
Yeah, material interests, things like access, that kind of thing. We talk about it a lot on this show. Corbyn also appeared on Newsnight last night, where he confronted Vanessa Neumann. Now, she's a Venezuelan opposition figure who was there to defend Trump's intervention.
What Jeremy Corbyn says about Donald Trump going into a sovereign country and snatching the leader, that breaks all international laws, does it not?
No, it does not break international laws. I think it was stunning to watch.
Which law does that allow? Which law allows that?
Well,
which law allows that?
Well, the law, the fact that he was a fugitive from justice and not a head of state, and the head of a criminal law, and the head of a criminal organization, and a criminal organization that I have personally been tracking and writing about since I started working for a think tank here in London, the IISS, in 2006. For 20 years, we've been tracking the criminal activity and the transnational threats presented first with the FARC across the border, and that was actually part of the Bolivarian Revolution, that was stated in part of their manifesto manifesto, the material support for the FARC, and then a terrorist organization. And my daughter's from Colombia because I spend so much time in Colombia working on those issues. So I track that, and then also the involvement of the agreement signed with China and with Iran, and giving succor and protection and cover for Iranian IRGC operatives, which I've chronicled, I think makes him a threat to the region.
What law? What law? What law? Incredulous Jeremy Corbyn is like my favourite flavour of Jeremy Corbyn. That argument went on.
You said he's a fugitive from justice.
Yes.
Where?
United States.
But he wasn't in the United States. He's been in Venezuela.
Doesn't matter where you are. You can be snatched and you can be captured. If you're a criminal on the run, you're a criminal you're a criminal in hiding, you can still be caught.
Why didn't they apply for extradition then?
Why didn't they apply for extradition?
Why didn't they apply for extradition?
From the Chavistas
That is the normal way. You seem to be agreeing with the idea that one powerful country can go in and take the head of state.
He's not a head of state.
What would you say if...
He's not a head of state.
What would
And
you
by the
say
way,
then if Putin went into Ukraine and took Zelensky out? What would you say then?
He's not, well, the same thing. Zelensky was elected. And now, Maduro was not elected. Ukraine, I'll leave Ukraine to the Ukraine experts.
Okay.
So I think what's interesting, what's happening there is the sort of making of fine distinctions to justify. I mean, Neumann denies that it's a breach of international law, but I think she knows it really is. And so to try and justify this action in a particular way, you make these fine distinctions between, okay, well, there's criminality involved here and there's not involved there. There were elections here and there weren't elections there. But actually, if you look at what Trump has said about Ukraine, one thing that he focuses on a lot is the fact that there haven't been elections in Ukraine. So whatever you throw in as a kind of reason to prevent, an aggressive, state like the current state of the US, an internationally aggressive state like the current US, from breaking international law, doing what it likes, might is right, or the law of the jungle, as Kieran put it earlier. There's always some way in which that can be the thing that they latch onto in order to create the case to do it, and we've seen that time and time again with various forms of interventionism. But later in the show, Neumann was confronted with the Trump administration's announcements about other potential military targets, including Colombia, Cuba, and Greenland.
I'm a Venezuelan, also an American, but I want to make a clear distinction between the case for Venezuela and what happened in the capture of Maduro and the argument for a transition toward democracy, which we have yet to see how exactly that will unfold, and is one of the things that I and other opposition leaders will still be pushing to do, right? In other words, our fight is still for democracy. And as I said, I know Venezuela, Colombia very well. Those countries still have elected leaders, okay? Those presidents came into office and left. The previous ones left office when they got voted out. The new man or woman came in when they were voted in, and they do not have a systematic form of repression, extrajudicial killings, murders, and tortures. They have problematic law enforcement and but it is not part of how they cling to the presidential palace. That is the distinction between Venezuela and Mexico and Colombia or Greenland. I'm not even going to get into. So the case for Venezuela for me, was very clear and very important. And it comes out of, by the way, the responsibility to protect. Did we forget about that? And I mention it because when I was writing my dissertation, the whole UN was all about our responsibility to protect, citizens.
Sure.
That if they can't stand up for themselves, somebody has to.
So, Kieran, what I find I can sort of understand why someone like Neumann there is making that kind of argument. So you're in opposition, you're a Venezuelan, let's assume, and this could be a significant assumption given the nature of some of the Venezuelan diaspora in the West, at least. Let's assume that you really do have the best interests of the country at heart and that kind of thing. The issue here, though, is that what you're doing is that you're making a case justifying the action of the US president on, what you might call humanitarian interventionist or liberal interventionist grounds, when it's very clear that those are not the grounds under which Trump has taken this action and taken Venezuela under US control, as he put it. He hasn't done it to make sure there are elections. In fact, he's now, he's just, as it were, taken control of the existing regime and its structures. It's very important for him to do that, because if he wants to get the oil out of Venezuela, he can't have the kind of chaos that might follow proper regime change, which is what I think the opposition abroad were hoping for. So what you're doing is you're sort of, because it's sort of, potentially, not even guaranteed, temporarily advantageous to you, you're providing succor to a kind of program or philosophy in terms of, the US's power relations to the rest of the world. You're supporting it, but you then are, as she was, slightly troubled by the fact that, it might have bad, by her point of view, bad consequences for other countries, and you want to distance yourself from that. But you can't do both at the same time, can you? You can't both say, oh, Trump did the right thing by going for Venezuela's oil because it temporarily, potentially benefits me, without endorsing the fact that he went for Venezuela's oil.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly depressing how cheaply and easily people will sell their own countries to a foreign colonial power if they think that it means that they will move up the social, economic, maybe not economic, because as you rightly say, most of them are from the upper crust of Venezuelan society anyway, but let's say the social and political hierarchies in their country. Grab the levers of power and the resources, in other words. If they think that there is power to be gained, as evidenced by what she was just saying, they are very happy to sell their countries down the river to the highest bid, to the highest colonial bidder, or in this case, the only game in town. And it's incredibly depressing. But I think it speaks to, something we ought not be misty-eyed about, which is that actually we think of this in terms of nation states, and that's fine. I don't want to sound too kind of old hat Marxist, but it's true that these guys have class interests that cut across the country. Interests with each other. They are the ruling class that were deposed, as they see it, by Chavez in 1998. And they're trying desperately to get back into power. A lot of those characters are the same characters, or the children of the characters that existed before the Chavismo revolution in 98, 99. And they've never regarded it as legitimate. And they have been waiting in the wings desperately, and it's become an obsession for many of them. And so I think we need to also think about it on that axis, not just the national axis, Venezuelan, but also the class axis, which is that there is a ruling class in Venezuela which feels it was deposed illegitimately and has been waiting ever since to get back into power. And she very clearly articulates their position.
Yeah, I want to be clear that when I mentioned the Venezuela diaspora or the Venezuelans in exile, and I mentioned the ones in the West, it's not. You're completely right. There are 8 million Venezuelans in exile and who have left the country since the Bolivarian Revolution, but many of them have left under Maduro, and many of them remain in countries around Venezuela in poverty. It's as you say, an earlier middle class of exiles that left who, have a kind of neoliberal politics and would like to see closer neoliberal commercial relationships with big states like the US.
Exactly.
Okay, well, look, let's give Corbyn the last word on this part of the show. This is from yet another appearance last night, this time on LBC with Andrew Marr.
This whole international order thing, maybe it's over.
If it is over, what do we replace it with other than a lack of power in the UN, where we have an overpowerful Security Council and an underpowered General Assembly? We have no basis for international law. Are we actually moving into the sort of 1984 Orwell scenario where there's an eternal war between three big powers, USA, China, Russia? Because Trump's security document actually leaves China and Russia out of the equation.
You see, that seems to be a much more realistic assessment or sketch of where we are than the international order. We have the three great empires and the three great emperors.
Indeed, that is exactly where it's going and where Trump has taken us to.
So what do you think about that, Kieran, the idea that we're now in the time of three great emperors, three great empires? I mean, that would be the US, Russia, and China.
I think we have pattern-seeking minds as a species, and we need to understand transitions within, recognisable forms. I would say, look, I don't want to completely dismiss it. I think to pick it apart more finely, first of all, that overplays Russia that overplays Russia's power and influence. I do think that Russia is obviously still a significant power. It's a regional hegemon. But to cede, presumably within this tripartite system, to cede all of Europe to Russia, I think that is in danger of lapsing into kind of delirious or hysterical fear-mongering about, the sort of expansionist threat of Russia. That's the first thing. I think Russia is actually economically has, and I know that this isn't original, many people have said this, has enormous structural problems or challenges to scale and to face once, and we don't know when it will be, its war economy starts to be mothballed. So that's the first thing. So I think it overplays Russia's influence. China, of course, is absolutely has a sphere of influence, and whatever you might say about the kind of vicissitudes of its economy, it is growing in power and it's growing in relative power within the international system. It's also it keeps its powder very dry. I mean, look, we don't see at this stage in its development the kind of interventionism that we saw in, say, the United States at an equivalent time. Yes, it has the Belt and the Highway strategy, which is a form of, economic imperialism, you might say, through free trade or whatever. And it has a sphere of influence, and it's clear about that. It's clear about what it will tolerate people interfering with and not. But it doesn't have a Monroe Doctrine, and it hasn't used its military for anything far beyond its borders or in another continent. So that's another thing. But certainly it's a huge, it has a sphere of influence. The United States, I still think the United States is in decline. And I think Trumpism is an attempt to try and not distract, to try and enchant, true believers away from that reality. But we can get into why I think that later. I think there'll be more opportunity to talk about it. But no, I think the US is still extremely powerful. And it might be squeezing the toothpaste a little bit harder than it has been for the past 20, 30 years. But I do think it is fundamentally a superpower in relative decline.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of these kind of desperate acts look like something in decline, right? You're sort of grabbing at whatever you can hold on to stop yourself fading. But of course, sometimes doing that can make you go down even faster, I guess.